Hey everybody, have you noticed how important the quality of the watercolor paper is when you're doing watercolors because it directly affects the outcome? We try to recreate a lot of art but we don't get the same kind of feel, and that's because you've not selected the right watercolor paper. Today we are going to remove all those myths, clear all the details about watercolor papers just for you. So even if you're a beginner, you're going to get a lot of information in this particular video and learn all about watercolor papers. And of course, if you're somebody who's coming to this channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe, press on the bell button. It's absolutely free because you're going to get a lot of information, a lot of learning from this channel. Today we're going to discuss two primary differences in watercolor papers. That's hot press paper versus cold press paper. And I'm sure you've got 1,000 questions running in your mind. Before we get started, I'm promising you this. It's going to be a very fun session, a lot of detail. And we are going to cover all the details differences between the hot press versus the cold press paper. I'm using the papers, 300 GSM papers from Scholar, but you can use any papers that you want. It's completely fine. See to that you select two different textures to get the understanding between the two. So let's get started with the video where I will explain exactly the difference between hot press versus cold press papers. Let me just quickly show you all some of the artworks that I've done on the hot press versus the cold press paper. So this was the ink and watercolor artwork that I've done. This is a complete watercolor work. So as you can see, the smoothness in the paper is something that I really enjoy. Okay, so I have used both the papers, and this is even wash that was done on hot press paper. So I want you to notice how each and every artwork looks very bright, and that's the kind of style that I have. This is all done on hot press paper. These are all done on the cold press papers. So like you see, there's a smooth roughness to it. I don't know if you can notice it on the video, but it's very clear, evident in this one. So these are all works that are done on the cold press paper. So different subjects are all ink and watercolors or just watercolors. I especially love the still life that is done over here on the cold press paper. And of course, I've got the architecture works, so you can see both of them. Again, try what works for you, and that way you can decide what paper is best for you. Let's start with understanding the hot press watercolor paper pad from Scholar. So as you guys can notice, the texture is really smooth, and that's primarily the main characteristic of a watercolor hot press paper. As this surface is very smooth, the kind of details that you get with a hot press paper are usually considered to be a little better than cold press paper in that sense. I'm starting with this, creating some kind of a floral bunch on the paper. The watercolor is very new. That's probably why it's not coming out that well. So just ignore that for now. But as we go ahead, I think once the water starts getting inside, it will give you the vibrancy it requires. So just using the strokes, it's not to show you the watercolor composition, but just to kind of show you how the paper is really smooth. So when you kind of add the color on it, the color moves much more smoothly. You don't see any grooves, you don't see any depressions, you don't see any of those effects. But you will find that somehow or the other, you get more working time. Primarily with hot press paper, it's less absorbent, which means that while the color is drying off, you'll still get a lot of time to work with it. You can actually layer really well with hot pressed watercolor papers compared to the blending. So each layer has its distinction that is very clearly seen. So I'm just making these strokes, and you can see how my brush is quite gliding. There's no resistance to the brush movement also when I'm doing these strokes of the stems. So when you're doing the hot press watercolor, you'll find that this flow is much more easier. And once I demonstrate it with the pen, you'll find that it's even easier to do it. Now, whether you choose or not, we'll talk about it as we move forward. Let me just demonstrate by actually taking some, and spreading some color. So let's take a swatch. So, when I'm swatching, see, one I've taken more color, the other one I've taken a little bit of more water. And again, I'm dipping in new color. And you guys can see how clearly the texture of the paper shows that it's really, really smooth by itself. I'll even do two circles to show you lifting of color. Lifting is basically subtraction. So even though a color is wet or it's dried off and you re-wet it, you can pick up some color. And cold press versus hot press has this difference. Hot press, you'll find that once it's in fact when it's wet, it's even better. that you'll be able to pick up color much more easier because it's less absorbent, which means that it will take more time to, you get more time to paint before it dries off. You'll be able to see this also. While this was still wet, I'm adding the new layer and you can see that it's quite wet, right? Let's understand the smoothness through a pen. Okay, so pen, pencils, or any of those work really well on a hot press. You can see that there is no grainy surface. It's completely smooth. All my strokes are clearly seen. There was no, break in any of the strokes while I was making them. So it looks like you're working, on a very smooth paper. So if you're somebody who wants a lot of ink work and you don't want the texture of the paper to show through, this works beautifully. I'm just lifting some color. So I've wet the brush, I wet the area, and I'm taking a tissue and picking up. As you can see, it clearly lifted off the color very easily, even though it was dried. The reason I showed you while it is dried is to show that it's possible to pick up color in a hot press much more easier as compared to a cold press. One of the characteristics of using hot press papers. If you're somebody who likes to do corrections or likes subtraction, it's a good technique. Let's move to the cold press paper. Here you can see the roughness of the paper that I just demonstrated. Both the papers are 300 GSM, so they are thick papers to use. And the color here, of course, the watercolor got activated by that time sufficiently. And that's why you can see the vibrancy. But technically, both the papers, personally, I found that they were really good to use. And both of them could be used easily. So ignore the first part where the color looked a little bit lighter in that sense. Now with cold press paper, you will notice even in the video you can see that dents and that grooves, and you can see this roughness in the paper, and that's its typical watercolor speciality. You'll find a lot of watercolor artists tend to gravitate quite commonly towards cold press paper. It's easily available also. Now the main difference actually between the two is how they were manufactured, right? The way the cold press versus hot press was manufactured. They are both available in different way, different sizes. Cold press usually, goes through cold metal rollers, which creates a rougher texture. So it's very good for washes, glazes, wet on wet techniques. It's often also used very commonly for mixed media and other art forms that require a more textured surface. The hot press, which we had done earlier, was comparatively made through, to a certain, roller where it smooths out the surface. So here I'm just showing you the stem, and if you notice the stem, you'll very carefully, you'll realize that there's a little bit of breaks in the stem, a small amount of stem, that little bit of breaks are seen. That's how that roughness comes in. You'll appreciate it much more now. Let me just show you. See, as you can see, when I'm applying the layer in the same way that I had done it earlier, now you can appreciate how the brush is sort of resisting the movement, and even when the lower part is there, you can see that. So that watercolor texture effect which comes in the paper is something I absolutely love. I've been commonly using cold press most of the time. Let's again demonstrate the lifting. Okay, and don't worry about the pigmentation. That's only because that color got reactivated and got activated now. I hope you've understood the differences that are coming in. The hot press creates that uniform texture, great for detail work, fine line work, precise brush work, even ink work. But the cold press has its more typical characteristic of being used to try various techniques, various watercolor techniques. Secondly, blending. You'll find that blending in watercolors in cold press appears like when you add a new layer, you'll find that blending seems to be more, whereas layering seems to be better in the hot press. Okay, let me just show you the writing. So it may look a little similar, but now you'll notice in this, once I make the strokes, you can clearly notice that if I'm just making continuous strokes also, that break is there. Can you see that break which was not there? If you want, go back to the hot press part and you realize these breaks which are there in the line work were not there at that stage of time. Let's try some lifting. Okay, and I'm wetting and trying to pick the color up, and you notice that the lifting was comparatively much better in the hot press as compared to the cold press. So again, if you're somebody who likes to do subtractive techniques, then maybe you might prefer the hot press paper versus the cold press. No paper is wrong. What matters ultimately is the artist's need. What you feel comfortable definitely is what you should use. But remember, never sacrifice paper quality because watercolors require good quality watercolor papers. So this is the comparison between the hot press and the cold press paper. You can see how the works are looking different, although vibrancy is the same. Well, so as I mentioned, I really love the cold press papers more, especially because of the texture that it gives in. I've always been using them since a long time, and I personally prefer them. Of course, how do you know what should you choose? Try them out. Unless you try them out, you will not know the difference between the two. Some people like the texture, some people want the smoothness, whatever works for you. Especially if you're somebody who likes a lot of ink work, like I do like ink work, and technically hot press should be my choice. But I love the texture that a cold press can always give. So that's my personal choice. What I want you to do is try both of them. Comment and let us know exactly which kind of paper do you prefer and why. If you like the video, please share this, save the video, like the video, tell others about it. I'm sure everybody is going to get some benefit out of it. And don't forget to press on the bell icon and the subscribe button so that you get notifications on any new videos that are coming in. I hope we were able to cover a lot of details about hot press versus cold press in this particular video. And don't forget, I'm seeing all of you all on this Sunday. So bye bye. See you all very, very soon.